You are listening to the Yield to Reason podcast, where we help you build a bulletproof retirement with a keen eye on investment income, because independent wealth hinges on your ability to pay the bills. We're dedicated to solving retirement's biggest riddle: how to turn your hard-earned savings into spendable cash, so you can enjoy the retirement you actually want and make it the retirement you truly deserve. I am Brandon Roberts. Thanks so much for joining me today as we discuss a growing and very unpopular trend among retirees, a reality forced upon a number of people in their 60s and 70s that a lot of us assume could never happen to us. But the numbers tell us we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss the likelihood of it becoming our reality. We're talking about returning to work after retiring, or unretirement, as it's now being called. Older Americans are returning to work. CNBC recently addressed this trend, and they're not breaking any news here. We've known this for a while. It's been going on. There's numerous surveys spanning several years now that have continuously identified that American retirees are planning or are in the process, or rather they already have, returned to work. And this is something that we actually talked about on the Yield to Reason podcast last year, when we addressed the fact that the idea that there's kind of a standard or typical American retirement may be a fantasy. So not new territory here, but something that we needed to address because there are some insights from the data regarding unretirement that are worth noting for a couple different reasons. One, they give us a better understanding of what retirees are facing. But two, they also give us some glimpse into an action plan on things that you can do right now, even if you're not retired, to try and avoid this reality. So when we look at the survey data about unretirement, the overwhelming reason people are identifying for their need to unretire is cost of living. It comprises about 50% of all the individuals who are now unretired or are planning to soon unretire. And comparatively, boredom is in a very distant second place at roughly 15% of surveyed American retirees. So the motivation to return to work has a lot to do with the inability to meet expenses among retired Americans. And those who are deciding retirement really wasn't for them are in a very, very small minority of respondents who have chosen to go back to work. What's more, we're finding the number of people who are unretiring, specifically because they're having a hard time meeting expenses, keeps rising each year that these surveys get conducted. As of this past year, 7% of retirees note their plans to unretire or have already unretired. That's up from 6% the prior year, which may not sound like a lot. But keep in mind, there are roughly 55 million American retirees. So a 1% increase tells us that 550,000 more people have decided that they need to go back to work. That's basically the population of the state of Wyoming have made it to retirement, but decided, oh, darn, I can't afford to remain retired. The fact that people are unretiring is noteworthy all on its own, but I get the headline reason of I can't afford to be this way, retired. But I wanted to understand a little bit deeper what's driving this. So I set out to collect data that tries to find out why, in addition to just saying, hey, I can't pay the bills, people are in fact having to unretire. Now, there's a good amount of descriptive data here that shows us who is at risk of unretirement, mostly demographic in nature. So we do know that African-American females who are divorced are at the highest risk of unretiring. We also know that there's a little bit of higher tendency to unretire if you don't hold a college degree. Now, that information is potentially useful from a policy-making perspective. This is not at all a policy-making podcast. We're going to stay in our lane and not try to sort out world problems from a policy perspective. We're going to stick with what you can do on an individualized basis to try and avoid this reality. So demographic information is useful to some people, but not particularly actionable for us at the Yield to Reason podcast. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper and try to figure out, do we know what asset compositions are among those who are unretiring, or income sources are for those who are unretiring? And sadly, nobody really thought to collect that data when it comes to these research endeavors. So we don't really know intimately what the overall asset breakdown or savings plan strategy was among Americans who are unretiring, with a couple of exceptions. What we do know is that those who unretire tend to have the lowest percentage of guaranteed income in retirement. And the inverse is certainly true. Those who are at lowest risk or generally not thinking about unretiring are individuals with the highest level of guaranteed income. Now, this guaranteed income comes from a couple different sources. Social Security is absolutely one of them. So people with higher Social Security benefits, or those who are in a position where Social Security just happens to comprise a much larger percentage of their kind of ongoing rigid income needs, are individuals who are at lower risk of unretiring. Not surprisingly, those who were fortunate enough to be part of a pension plan have a very, very low incidence of unretiring. And then there is also a group of people who own annuities who seem to be at extremely low risk of unretiring. In fact, TIAA data shows us that there's a pretty sizable success that takes place among retirees who incorporate annuities into their investment portfolio plan in sort of substitution of bonds. So the idea was, all right, if they opt for annuities versus using bonds as a low risk component of the portfolio, do we see a difference in terms of retirement security and success? And according to TIAA, the answer is yes, that does happen. And they also identified attitudinally among retirees surveyed that those who have bought an annuity note much greater degrees of feeling financially secure than those who did not buy an annuity. Now, okay, this raises an interesting question. Does this mean that in order to live securely, financially speaking, in retirement or avoid unretirement, do I have to go out and buy an annuity? No, I don't think the answer to that is yes. I think that you can totally consider an annuity. And I think the data is pretty obvious that it will create a certain degree of financial security and reduce potentially the risks of unretiring. But I also think that there are some other things that you can do that are not annuity related to accomplish some of the same things that annuities are doing for people that would put you in a place where the risk of unretiring is substantially less. There are essentially two steps to this process. First and foremost, you have to understand your income needs in retirement. It's a task that you really should complete prior to retiring, and it should be a task that you complete several years prior to retiring. Having a good grasp of what your likely expenses are going to be in retirement is the single greatest roadmap you can build for determining the likelihood of retirement success, but also understanding where you are on the track of achieving a successful retirement. Now, when it comes to income planning, it's going to break down broadly into two categories, your non-negotiables and your negotiables. Your non-negotiables are things that are fixed expenses that are going to come up generally every month. They may have some other frequency like quarterly or yearly, but these are things that you simply cannot go without. So the groceries, utilities, property tax, insurance expenses. These are things that you cannot cut. You may be able to manipulate them ever so slightly, plus or minus. You could shop for better insurance rates. You could potentially sub out expensive groceries for less expensive groceries. But your utility bill, your property tax bill, those aren't going to change meaningfully for most people in retirement. Now, the negotiable side are things that are considered much more discretionary, things that are, we might argue, a little bit more fun, things like vacations, gifts, entertainment, hobbies, things of that nature. Now, I want to be very clear about something. this simplistic split or categorization isn't quite as neat and clean for most people as I'm making it sound, because there is going to be a divergence of opinion when it comes to negotiable and non-negotiable income, just because lifestyles differ. So there's some gray area here. There may be things that somebody says is a non-negotiable expense that others would look at and say, yeah, that's totally negotiable. So be aware that there is no hard and fast rule, for the most part, on what will ultimately be categorized in one bucket versus another. And there is this overlap. And that's totally okay, by the way. What I would encourage is that you kind of think about this overlapping gray area as something that you could kind of transition something that in general may be a mostly negotiable expense, but in your eyes, you would really prefer it to be considered non-negotiable. Maybe it's the case for you that going on vacation, however frequently you want to and wherever you go is just something that is very beneficial for your mental health. And so from your overall well-being perspective, it's really a non-negotiable expense that must be factored in and must be accounted for when it comes to your retirement income needs. But at the end of the day, if something happened and you simply needed to make cuts in the budget, you could do it. You wouldn't be happy about it, but you wouldn't die. That's something that I would encourage you to think about in terms of some of those perhaps generally regarded as negotiable, but in your eyes, you would like to account them as non-negotiable items in your retirement income needs. And that's totally okay, as long as you understand that, all right, instead of this or that category, it's kind of in the middle in this gray area. I'm going to make my best efforts to be able to afford this, but I do understand that it's an area where I could cut. I would not be happy about it at all, but it would be something that would keep me, for example, from having to unretire. Now, unsurprisingly, you want to cover your non-negotiable items with guaranteed income. Social Security, pension, annuities, all great sources. But if you happen to be in the position where you don't want to buy an annuity, your Social Security income is not that high, you can, I would argue, use lesser guaranteed income-focused style investments to cover your guaranteed needs with two very important rules in mind. One, you have to accept the volatility possibilities because they exist. The income that you would generate from something like a dividend-paying stock, a REIT, a closed-end fund, those are not going to provide the same guarantees that Social Security, pension, and annuities are going to offer. So we have to be aware of that volatility, and that brings us to step two. We should not take 100% of the income that we would generate from those style investments and just say, well, that covers my income needs. So for example, if you happen to own assets in a portfolio that are, let's call it market exposed, things that do not have a guaranteed income, but they have a stable income, you should account for 2/3 at most of that income for your guaranteed needs. So if that income comes out to $10,000 a month, $6,600 of it you could look at for guaranteed purposes. I say 2/3 because that gives you a very good contingency for the possibility that distribution cuts could take place. You may not receive the same dividend from this asset throughout your entire retirement, and that may cause you to need to make adjustments. So if you only consider 2/3 of it for your guaranteed needs, you've got wiggle room in the event distributions or dividends or whatever it is that you're receiving are reduced, and you now don't have quite as much income as you once did. Now, ideally, you will receive the income that you are expecting from this asset, and I would take that remaining third and reinvest it. Because if you're in a position where you're retired, you have income, and you have income that is in excess of your needs, then reinvesting is one of the greatest activities you can pursue to further reduce the risk of unretiring or just stretching your budget to a place where you're starting to get a little financially uncomfortable. And in general, even if you're going to follow the roadmap here perfectly, so guaranteed or the non-negotiable expenses, those are going to be covered with Social Security and an annuity, for example. And the negotiable stuff, we're gonna have income producing assets, and that's going to get covered. The negotiable income is going to get covered with the income producing assets that are more market exposed. I would still argue that you should probably use something in the neighborhood of 2/3 of your market exposed income to cover those negotiable expenses and still try to have a contingency of excess income that can be reinvested, because that will be the greatest way that you can ensure that you will have a stronger income producing portfolio as time goes on and income needs might change, either because distributions change or because income needs, or excuse me, cost of living increases create higher income needs. Now, this raises a question people often ask when I have this conversation with them on an individualized basis, which is, well, which one's the better one? Like, if you're telling me I can choose between them, why would I do one versus the other? Like, if I don't necessarily need an annuity, why buy one? And what would be the benefit to having it versus just going out and buying the market exposed income producing assets and using those instead? So annuities offer guarantees. There's no getting around that. They would very easily meet income needs, provided that you can match the income at the outset to the specific fixed expense that is non-negotiable. That one's pretty clear and easy, and there's nothing that's going to go on that is going to change, for example, the income that is produced by the annuity. They are contractually guaranteed from the outset, so that income you can rely on. But there is a certain degree of forfeiting legacy value when you buy an annuity. So the yield that you can get per dollar going into an annuity is generally quite high, but it's going to come with the sacrifice of money that might be left over to your heirs, for example. If you use, alternatively, market-linked assets that are producing income and following this 2/3 rule, you have a much higher likelihood of having some residual value that you can bequeath to your heirs, whoever they may be. And that may be of high interest to a number of people. And you may be in a position where you leave the shares behind. So your kids, for example, receive shares in these various assets that you own, and now they can just collect the income that it creates. They don't have to sell anything, for example. It's a fairly attractive model to follow when it comes to giving your children or grandchildren something that they will be able to benefit for many, many years of their life. And that is understandably one of the reasons people have some degree of attractiveness towards things that are more market exposed but income producing versus an annuity, because ultimately the annuity will have very little, in most cases, zero legacy value that will be left behind. But don't overlook the fact that you have to take care of yourself. So even though the annuity will not create legacy benefits to any sizable degree in most cases, they will generally create higher degrees of income and certainly higher degrees of guaranteed income. Now, circumstances, they differ from person to person. As a really, really good for instance, you may have some non-negotiable income needs that will decline in retirement. Perhaps you enter retirement with a mortgage, but it's only going to last for like 3 years into retirement. That would absolutely be a non-negotiable income need. But once it's gone, and you can reallocate. Now, one way of approaching this is to just decide, well, there is going to be some income coming in from an annuity, and once the mortgage is paid off, I'll just take that income and allocate it towards some of my more negotiable expenses. Or I'll take that income and I'll reinvest it to further build my income producing capacity. But you might also look at this and say, well, because it's only going to exist for 3 years, I'm going to instead focus market-linked, lesser guaranteed income on paying that mortgage, because I evaluate the risk is pretty limited that I'm going to face a distribution cut that would put me in a place where I can't pay my mortgage. But I really, really don't think this ultimately is a one or the other kind of discussion. It really works best when we use both to maximize what both can bring to the table. The benefits that you can get from guaranteed income are quite remarkable largely understated in most circles, especially in the retirement planning and investment world. But I have seen from personal experience, and the data shows us time and again, that people rank guaranteed income very, very highly when it comes to financial security, peace of mind, as well as something that is a desirable goal to accomplish in retirement. But you can go too far with it. So there's a limited number of people who want everything guaranteed. And that's fine. If that's your preference, that's who you are, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you are in the minority. There is a much greater number of Americans who would like a degree of guaranteed income, but they also want greater exposure to the market in general, or more flexibility with respect to what they might be able to accomplish asset growth-wise in retirement, which you can do with income-focused assets. But that gets us to another point here that we must address, because I think there may be a misnomer developing with the Yield to Reason podcast, in the sense that some people might be making the assumption that this is all about foregoing accumulation-styled assets and instead starting to invest heavily in income. And while I want to shift the focus in the direction of being mindful of income-style investing, I do not for a second wish to forsake entirely growth-style investments. And I also do not want to advocate for zero growth-style investments in retirement. There is absolutely a benefit to owning growth-focused assets in addition to income-focused assets in retirement. But I do believe quite strongly the way you need to approach growth-style assets in retirement differs than the traditional paradigm that gets used in retirement planning. So there's always been this discussion about the percentage of stocks that you should own at varying ages or varying points of your life. And there tends to be an advocacy for higher equity exposure because you can benefit from the appreciation of the U.S. stock market, and that can do some really great things. And even the data that led to the 4% rule showed a pretty high percentage of equity exposure to take advantage of booms as they happen, and note that, well, if we have a safer allocation, then that can kind of hedge or minimize the impact of a major correction. There was research that was conducted by Michael Kitces and Wade Pfau a number of years ago now that looked at the right amount of equity exposure for retirees and thought about it a bit dynamically, in the sense that we want to balance the desire for growth against the negative consequences that can come along with the risks that you are exposed to with growth, chiefly sequence of returns risk. So what they ultimately landed on was an asset allocation to equities early on in retirement that was quite low. Some might even argue laughably low, because it ranged somewhere between 20 and 40%, being the ideal composition of equities in your portfolio for the first several years of retirement. And the logic here is, we know that sequence of returns risk is most dangerous in the first 5 years of retirement. Some might extend it out to 10 years, but that 1 to 5 year range is like critically dangerous. And then 5 to 10 becomes moderately dangerous. So the recommendation here was, if you limit your equity exposure to something like 20 to 40% in that first 5 to maybe 10 years, but you also know, or you also plan to ratchet up considerably your equity exposure as time goes on, you will create the support for a substantially higher withdrawal rate from your portfolio, and you'll also create a higher overall legacy value generated by your portfolio. And in fact, the later years equity exposure got up to like 80% in their analysis, which is high enough to the degree that I think there'd be some resistance among a number of retirees, just given the exposure of volatility that they might face. But their models showed that this approach created significantly higher support for higher withdrawal rates and growth of the portfolio, while minimizing very considerably the unfavorable consequences of sequence of returns risk. So that's a really, really long way of saying, do not overlook what growth-focused investments can do for you. But please, 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 please keep in mind that this is a multi-pronged approach to retirement and income, where focusing your efforts largely on income-producing assets is the chief winning strategy that a lot of people are overlooking. But once you've started to develop an appreciation and understanding for income-focused investing, you can't go 100%. You've got to keep some degree of growth style assets in the portfolio because they will provide significant benefit as time unfolds in retirement. So let's talk about the best practices you can put in motion to avoid the consequences that lead to unretirement. First and foremost, you have to start thinking about what your income needs realistically are going to be in retirement. And furthermore, you have to understand what they're realistically going to be from a more than just superficial standpoint. So there's a lot of articles that have been written that will say something like, well, you take a percentage of your current income if you are, let's say, within 10 years of retirement, and that'll give you a really good idea of what your income needs are going to be. That's okay, but you need to further break down what will be negotiable, what will be non-negotiable. And this isn't a super duper fun exercise, but it's an important exercise. And it's one that will give you a very solid understanding of where you stand with regards to retirement preparedness. And you might discover that you're not saving enough. And you need to make more effort to creating a bigger portfolio to accomplish your income needs in retirement. And that's a much better wake-up call if it takes place 15 years before retirement than 5 years before retirement. Also, you need to be thinking about what you're going to do to create the income that will be necessary in retirement. So if you haven't already started transitioning your portfolio partly into income-producing assets, it would be a good time to think about it because you can compound yield over time. And there may be circumstances that exist just broader economic trend-wise that would make now or a year from now a better or worse time to start purchasing income-style investments. Had you been thinking about income investing just a couple years ago, there are a number of closed-end funds in particular that you could have bought at yields that had not existed in a long time and I don't think will exist for some time in the future. And those yields haven't changed. Those distributions haven't changed. So you could have bought some very solid funds that have great track records for distribution stability at yields 100 or 200 basis points above their average. And yes, you can't buy them at that yield now, but you bought them a while ago at that yield and you still have that yield. And arguably, if you take those distributions and reinvest them, all you're doing is augmenting what you accomplished, which was already quite remarkable. You can't just do that if you get to retirement, liquidate your position in an S&P 500 index fund, and then try to buy up a bunch of yield at that moment. It doesn't quite work out that way. And you might want to look at annuities as well. You can, in most cases, maximize some pretty good income benefits by buying an annuity just at retirement. There's a couple different strategies you might actually want to employ to approach annuities versus just one singular purchase. But there are some that buying in advance would further enhance the income benefit if you defer income for a few years. So there's some nuance to that approach that may be very beneficial. But understand that guaranteed or nearly guaranteed income will play a very pivotal role in your avoiding unretirement. Also, don't overlook the strength of working for an extra year or two, because the data shows us people who do that, they kind of delay retirement by a year or two, have a pretty sizable impact on their overall financial resiliency in retirement. It doesn't seem like it would add much, but it does tend to work out favorably for enhanced financial security. And also remember, growth style assets are still going to play a critical role in retirement, but you should probably limit your exposure much more significantly than traditional financial advice tends to suggest. So doing these things together is going to be your best bet at minimizing what a lot of Americans are facing as a reality. The other thing you might discover if you start planning out income now is that you don't need quite as much money as you thought you did. So yes, there's a possibility you might find that you're not quite on track to the degree you need to be. There's also a chance you might find you're further ahead than you thought you were. If you are, for example, planning a $50,000 a year income from non-Social Security sources in retirement, and we're using very traditional advice of the 4% rule, that would mean you need $1.25 million to withdraw 4% and have a $50,000 income. But you might also find that you can get a 6% yield if you have a combination of income style assets, which would mean you only need roughly $850,000. It's actually less than that, but I'm rounding up. That's $400,000 fewer dollars that are necessary to create the same amount of income. And if you do this exercise ahead of time, you might discover that you are in a better financial position than you thought, or you simply don't need as much money as you thought you were going to need to ultimately take the plunge into retirement. That's enough out of me for today. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, check out the Yield to Reason YouTube channel. And until next week, please remember, real wealth doesn't just add up, it writes checks.